Okay, we're live. Good. I'm Jimmy. Welcome to Philosophy Hour with Philosophy for Everyday Life. If you're new here, this is a live stream I hold every Thursday morning at 10 a.m. Central Time. And the idea is to get into a specific philosophical text. And what I like about this approach is it's, one way to approach philosophy or philosophical ideas is to talk about them and for me to tell you about them or for someone to tell you what they are, maybe to try to boil them down in some fashion. What I try to do here is actually to invite the audience into the text itself so that we can sort of begin to get some familiarity, not just with the big picture of the ideas, but with how an author unpacks those ideas and expresses them, and to begin to become familiar with sort of the language of the text itself. An image that came to mind recently for this is if you've ever hiked up a mountain, there are actually two ways you might do it. One is some you can actually drive up to the top. Pikes Peak in Colorado is an example. You can drive all the way to 14,000 feet. And once you're up there, you can see the views. That's kind of the way that a lot of, say, philosophy videos on YouTube are done. They take you up to the top and they show you what it looks like from up there. Another way to get up to the top of Pikes Peak would be to hike up yourself, starting from some point lower down. And you get the same view at the top, but along the way, you get all kinds of other views and perspective on what Pikes Peak is, what it's like, what it feels like to be there, to be on it. And that's more like what I'm trying to do here, is to invite us to take some portion of the hike up this mountain that is, in this case, the writing of Michel de Certeau. So that's what I'm trying to do in these live streams. That's the approach I'm taking. I'll say more about de Certeau in a moment. But if you're not familiar with me, my background is in philosophy, ethics, and religious studies. I have a PhD and used to teach at university, and now I'm exploring this as an alternative way of teaching. I'm on Substack if you'd like to connect further. I have some writing there, and if you'd like to stay up to date with these live streams and with other things going on, you can head over to my Substack. There will be a link in the description. And if you're interested in live virtual discussions on Zoom, those will be happening as well in the near future. So feel free to head over there if that's something that would be of interest to you. Okay, so Michel de Certeau, he was a French social theorist. He was actually a Jesuit priest, and he wrote from primarily the 50s through the 80s. He died in, I believe, 1986. This is my fourth live stream on Michel de Certeau's book, The Practice of Everyday Life. Make sure that we're good here with display, yeah. The big distinction, or the big core idea of this book, is the distinction between strategies and tactics. So if you want to know more about that, my other videos discuss this in some detail. But the basic idea is that a strategy is the way that someone in a position of power who controls a place and an environment takes action on the world. Whereas a tactic is the way that someone without power, who has to take advantage of specific moments, has to sort of seize the opportunity as it arises, and maybe to be kind of subversive and to use the position of the powerful against them. This is called a tactic. This is the way that, this is the alternative mode of acting. And de Certeau's book is structured as a series of analogies designed to unpack this distinction. But he's also interested in interacting with other French social theorists of his generation, and the two most important ones being Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu. Last week we talked about Foucault. This week I'm going to discuss Bourdieu and to see how that goes. So this is the section on Bourdieu in chapter 4 of The Practice of Everyday Life. And before we get into this section, I actually want to take a step back and talk about Bourdieu's thought just a little bit. And I was thinking about, what's the easiest way in to the writings of someone like Pierre Bourdieu or to his thought. And it struck me that one way of thinking about this is to reflect on the transition from what sometimes is called pre-modernity to modernity to post-modernity. And specifically with respect to the question of knowledge, because I think understanding what Bourdieu is doing, especially with a key idea of his called habitus, which is a Latin word for disposition or way of acting. Bourdieu's idea of habitus is really situated on the postmodern side of this kind of spectrum of ways of thinking about knowledge. So if we start with the pre-modern and go to someone like Aristotle, in his categories, which is not a very commonly read work, it's a little bit dry, but it has some interesting tidbits. He says that the knowable is always prior to knowledge. In other words, if there's a thing that you come to know, it has to be there first, sort of exist on its own terms, and then you encounter it. And when that happens, you have knowledge of it. So, here is Bourdieu's book. It exists over there on my chair, and I pick it up and I read it and I acquire knowledge. And the ideas are there before I ever come to encounter them. It's a pretty common sense point. And this is how Aristotle thinks about knowledge. So that's the pre-modern view of what counts as knowledge. If we move forward to a modern view, represented, I think, most importantly by someone like Immanuel Kant, he's going to say something that's very counterintuitive and kind of mind-bending, which is that actually all knowledge and experience is constructed by the person doing the knowing in the moment of the knowledge or experience. So there is no pre-existing thing out there that you come to know. And Kant makes this point by saying there's a distinction between things as they are in themselves, things themselves, which he calls noumena, and things as they appear, which he calls phenomena. And he says we can never encounter or know things as they are in themselves. They're fundamentally unknowable. But what we do is we receive input from the senses, and then our minds contribute this other thing, which are these deep structures of knowledge. Kant calls them the categories of the understanding. So things like substance and cause and effect, but also things like space and time. These are things that our minds, our understanding actually supplies to experience and to knowledge. So the thing known and the knowledge actually happen at the exact same time. They're constructed in the same moment, or they're part of the same experience. So Kant is making this radical diversion from Aristotle, from the sort of common sense idea that the thing that is known pre-exists the knowledge of it. Kant says, no, actually, the thing known and the knowledge of it arise at the exact same moment, and they're constructed in the same moment. There are things outside of us. He's not saying that everything exists sort of in our minds, but we have no access to things as they exist in themselves without the mediation of the structures of our understanding. Now, it would be easy to make a mistake here and to think that Kant is saying that all knowledge is subjective. He's not saying that, because these mental structures that we use to interpret and experience the world are necessary and universal. Everyone has the same structures, and it would be impossible for those structures to be any different than they are. So that's the modern view of knowledge, or at least that's what I'm calling the modern view of knowledge. Now, if we move to the postmodern view, and someone like Bourdieu, he's he's going to agree with Kant in rejecting Aristotle's position. He's going to agree with Kant that the thing known and the knowledge of it happen at the same time, that they're constructed together. He's going to disagree with Kant in that he thinks those structures have a social or a cultural component. Now, Bourdieu is not saying that you can just pick whatever structures you want, and he's not saying that everyone has different structures. He thinks they're unavoidable in a sense, but he still thinks they're there, and that they arise out of a social world and the practices that are baked into that world. I don't have a great example off the top of my head for this, but it's something like the common sense, practical picture of the world that is both unconscious and unavoidable for someone living in a particular society. So the way we might think about relationships, marriage, property ownership, how we arrange our space, what kind of food we eat, all these kinds of things are the practical social world that creates what Bourdieu calls a habitus. Now, I think it's helpful to understand Kant when we approach Bourdieu's idea of habitus, because a habitus is just as unavoidable as Kant's categories of the understanding. It just comes from a different place. It comes from a practical social structure rather than from these universal necessary laws of reason. So this is an introduction to Bourdieu's idea of habitus. Just read a couple of paragraphs or a couple of sentences of Bourdieu just to set us up for how de Certeau is going to respond. Amazingly, I think Bourdieu's writing is even harder than de Certeau's. But let's take a stab at this sentence. So he says that habitus are systems of durable, transposable dispositions. So this is not an individual's idiosyncratic perspective on the world. These dispositions are durable, and they're transposable. They go from person to person. They're structured structures, predisposed to function as structuring structures. Okay, so there's an active and a passive component here. Structured means something else comes in and creates the structure. There's a passive. The structure arises from some external source, but they function as structuring structures. In other words, they receive a structure from outside, but then they go on and perpetuate themselves by reproducing that structure. That is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes. So here he's agreeing with Immanuel Kant. It's objective. This is not an individual's idiosyncratic subjective way of experiencing the world. They can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them. So these structures or dispositions, a disposition is a sort of personal orientation in some way. They achieve their goal without consciously aiming at an objective. So if I have a habitus to approach, say, like going to work every day at a certain time, that habitus is going to structure my behavior and my life, even if I'm not consciously thinking of the goal that it produces. So it doesn't require a conscious intention or a mastery of the operations. It's a way that my mind and the structure of my experience has been shaped that then reproduces a new structure, whether I intend it or not. So if we look down here, this is slightly less abstract. The habitus, a product of history, produces individual and collective practices, more history. So that there's the structured and structuring. It's structured because it's a product of history, but it's structuring because it produces more history. It perpetuates itself in accordance with the schemes generated by history. It ensures the active presence of past experiences, which deposited in each organism in the form of schemes of perception thought, and action, tend to guarantee the correctness of practices and their constancy over time, more reliably than all formal rules or explicit norms. So he's making a distinction between, say, the explicit social rules that tell you, hey, you should do this or that, and the unconscious habitus that the social environment instills in all of its members. This system of dispositions, a present past that tends to perpetuate itself into the future by reactivation in similarly structured practices, an internal law through which the law of external necessities, irreducible to immediate constraints, is constantly exerted, is the principle of the continuity and regularity which objectivism sees in social practices without being able to account for it. So he's saying he's offering something here that lets us account for the consistency and objectivity of social practices, and also of the regulated transformations that cannot be explained either by the extrinsic, instantaneous determinations of mechanistic sociologism or by the purely internal but equally instantaneous determination of spontaneous subjectivism. So he thinks these two ideas that he's saying don't explain enough are that the social environment absolutely and fully determines our behavior, or that we are fully responsible for our behavior through our own subjective autonomy. He's saying both of those perspectives are inadequate, and the concept of habitus allows him to account for the insights of both of those perspectives while avoiding their weaknesses. So that's already a sort of significant amount of time discussing Bourdieu. It would certainly be valuable to spend more time reading his text. But now I want to go to what de Certeau has to say about Pierre Bourdieu. If you're new, if you're just jumping on, welcome. This is a discussion of Michel de Certeau's book, The Practice of Everyday Life, and specifically his section on Pierre Bourdieu. And we just got through a brief discussion of Bourdieu's idea of habitus, and now we're going to look at de Certeau himself. If you have a question or a comment, I would love to hear from you as well. Feel free to jump into the chat. Okay, so this is section 2 of chapter 4, Docta Ignorantia Bourdieu. Docta Ignorantia means learned ignorance. So de Certeau is a playful writer, and that's not only, I think, part of his personality, but it's part of his idea of being tactical, is to sort of be subversive and playful and kind of a trickster. And so he's already making fun of Bourdieu a little bit with his title, Learned Ignorance. He's saying Bourdieu is clearly very learned. He's brilliant, but there's something missing. So de Certeau writes, our tactics seem to be analyzable only indirectly through another society. My cat is making some noise over here. I think we're okay. The France of the Ancien Regime, or the 19th century, in the case of Foucault, Kabylia or Béarn, in that of Bourdieu, ancient Greece, in that of Vernant and Détienne, etc. So these different social theorists turn to some foreign culture in order to shed light on their own culture or on social theory in general. They return to us from afar, as though a different space were required in which to make visible and elucidate the tactics marginalized by the Western form of rationality. So by going to these other non-Western contexts, we learn something about our own Western rationalized societies, rationalized in the sense of Max Weber, which also includes an element of bureaucracy. Other regions give us back what our culture has excluded from its discourse. But have tactics not been defined precisely as what we have eliminated or lost? So these subversive modes of behavior that de Certeau wants to thematize, isn't that what we lost in the West? As in Tristes Tropiques, we travel abroad to discover in distant lands something whose presence at home has become unrecognizable. the tactical and rhetorical tricks condemned as illegitimate by the scientific family into which Freud long sought to be accepted as an adopted son. He also discovered, through the discovery and exploration of a terra incognita, unknown land, the unconscious. But they came to him from a more ancient and yet nearer region, from a Jewish foreignness he long rejected, and which rises with him into scientific discourse, but disguised as dreams and slips of the tongue. Freudianism might thus be considered as a combination of the legitimate strategies that issued from the Enlightenment and the turns that return from further back under the mantle of the unconscious. So he's kind of trying to create some initial room here in a Western, modern, rationalized society by saying, well, we have the unconscious. And as I've already noted, the unconscious is important for Bourdieu as well. So two halves. In Bourdieu's work, Esquisse d'une théorie de la pratique, précédée de trois études d'ethnologie kabyle. My French is no good, but essay on a theory of practice, proceedings from three ethnological studies of Kabylia. So this is his work. He's drawing on ethnography to do social theory. In this work, Kabylia plays the role of a Trojan horse within a theory of practice. The three texts devoted to it, the three best that Bourdieu has written, especially The Kabyle House or The World Reversed, serve as a multiple vanguard for a long epistemological discourse. Like poems, these three studies of Kabylian ethnology lead into a theory, a sort of commentary in prose, and provide it with a fund of material that can be indefinitely cited in marvelous fragments. In the end, at the point when Bourdieu publishes his three early texts, their referential and poetic locus is erased from the title, which reverts to commentary, a theory. And scattered in the effects that it produces in the authorized discourse, this Kabylian origin itself gradually disappears, a sun obscured by the speculative landscape that it still illuminates. These traits are already characteristic of the position of practice in theory. So de Certeau is already giving us some clues about what he does not like about Bourdieu, and I think this line here is especially important. So these ethnographic studies that Bourdieu has done, they obscure this theoretical landscape they illuminate this theoretical landscape that Bourdieu wants to explore. But then the ethnography is lost sight of. If you remember from I may not have read this in a live stream, but de Certeau has a translator's or a preface to the English edition of this book, where he says that what he's offering here is a study of the singular. De Certeau is really interested in the singular and the specific. And he thinks that it's great that Bourdieu starts out with these ethnographic studies, but then he drifts off into this theoretical landscape. And de Certeau is suggesting that as he moves into theory, he really loses sight of the singular, the practical, and the specific. And for de Certeau, that's a problem. This is no accident. Bourdieu's studies since 1972, which have been concerned with the practical sense, are organized in the same way, except for Avenir de classe et causalité du probable, with one variant, the study on matrimonial strategies, concerned precisely with the genealogical economy, which refers to the Béarn region of southwestern France, rather than Kabylia. Thus, 2 points of reference. Is it possible to say which, Béarn or Kabylia, is the doublet of the other? They represent two familiarities, the one determined and haunted by its distance from the native land, the other by the foreignness of its cultural difference. It nevertheless seems that Béarn, in France, not speaking, like every origin, had first to find a doublet in the Kabylian situation, so similar to that of his native land in the analysis Bourdieu gives of it, before it could be described. So he's saying Bourdieu has these two studies on matrimonial strategy, the sociology of that, these two ethnographies. But it was almost as if he couldn't do the ethnography of matrimonial strategy in his own country of France and Bern before having gone to this foreign country and looked at how it's done there. So having thus become objectifiable, it furnishes the real and legendary, where are the Bernians of yesteryear, support, allowing the introduction of the concept of habitus into the human sciences, which is the personal stamp Bourdieu has put on theory. Hence, the particularity of the originary experience is lost in its power of reorganizing the general discourse. So this is the problem I was mentioning before. De Certeau does not like it when particularity is lost in the attempt to theorize. Divided into two mutually enabling parts, the outline of a theory of practice is first of all an interdisciplinary operation. It is thus a metaphor in the sense that there is a passage from one genre to another, from ethnology to sociology. Things are, however, not that simple. It is difficult to situate the book. Does it depend on the interdisciplinary confrontations Bourdieu earlier urged? Confrontations that, going beyond the stage of simple exchanges of data, sought a reciprocal and explicit expression of the assumptions peculiar to each discipline? These confrontations are supposed to provide a mutual epistemological elucidation. In other words, by doing ethnography or ethnology and sociology together, both get illuminated in a new way. That's what Bourdieu is trying to do, but de Certeau is sort of raising some questions about this. They labor to bring their implicit foundations to light, the ambition and the myth of knowledge. But perhaps what is at stake is different and has to do rather with the otherness introduced by the move through which a discipline turns toward the darkness that surrounds and precedes it, not in order to eliminate it, but because it is inexpugnable and determining. In that case, theory would involve an effort on the part of a science to think through its relation to this exteriority and not be satisfied with correcting the rules of production or determining the limits of its validity. Is this the path that Bourdieu's discourse takes? In any event, practice shapes the opaque reality out of which a theoretical question can arise beyond the frontiers of any discipline. So this is dense, as de Certeau has been all throughout. What's he saying? He's asking about this mutual epistemological elucidation. He's asking about whether this brings the implicit foundations of different disciplines to light, this myth, ambition and myth of knowledge. Or maybe he's saying maybe there's a different thing. Maybe there's this otherness introduced by the move through which a discipline turns toward the darkness that surrounds and precedes it, not in order to eliminate it, but because it is inexpugnable and determining. In a way, he's asking about the unconscious of like a theoretical discipline or an academic discipline. Okay, I'm going to keep going because de Certeau is doing his kind of gesturing and alluding without making his full point yet. His ethnological studies have their own style. They are a sociologist's hobby, but like all hobbies, they are more serious than his regular work. So he's saying he takes his ethnology, his study of cultures, specific cultures, more seriously than his social theory. They are executed with a rare precision. Bourdieu never operates with more care for minute detail, with more perspicacity, with more virtuosity than in these studies. His texts even have something aesthetic about them, to the extent that a fragment, a particular and isolated form, becomes the figure of a global relation, and not merely a general one, between the discipline and a reality that is at once alien and decisive, primitive. This fragment of a society and an analysis is first of all the dwelling, which is, as we know, the reference of every metaphor, or better, a dwelling. Through the practices that articulate its interior space, it inverts the strategies of public space and silently organizes the language, a vocabulary, proverbs, etc. The inversion of the public order and the generation of discourse. These two characteristics also make the Kabylian dwelling the inverse of the French school, in which Bourdieu, who made it his specialty, sees nothing but the reproduction of the social hierarchies and the repetition of their ideologies. In relation to the society sociology deals with, the residence situated down there is thus in its peculiarity a contrary and determining place. So Bourdieu's society was organized by the school and the social structures, the social hierarchies of the school. The Kabylian dwelling is organized in a fundamentally different way. Bourdieu considers his study itself to be illegal with respect to the socioeconomic norms of the discipline. It plays too much on the symbolic scale. In short, it is a lapse. So Bourdieu's ethnography is somehow a lapse or a violation within the social hierarchy that Bourdieu himself inhabits. Theory must thus reabsorb the distance between the legalities of sociology and ethnological particularities. So he's created this gap between ethnology and sociology, and he has to do something about it because of his own social position. The rationality of a scientific field and the practices that arise outside it are to be rearticulated. The outline and subsequent articles effect the junction of these two elements. It is a delicate maneuver which consists in fitting the ethnological exception into an empty space in the sociological system. So doing ethnology, apparently as Bourdieu was doing it, was sort of a violation of social theory. I'm not sure exactly why that would be the case, but that's what de Certeau is saying. And he has to sort of delicately insert it into this academic structure in which he lives. So this is de Certeau commenting on what Bourdieu is doing and kind of situating it in its own social context. In order to follow this operation, we must consider its working more closely. On the one hand, the analysis of these particular practices, on the other, the role they are assigned in the construction of a theory. So what de Certeau is doing up to this point is highlighting how Bourdieu is working across two disciplines or two modes of academic discourse. There is ethnography, or a very careful empirical study of a specific culture, and there is social theory, this very theoretical, abstract attempt to define generalizable principles. And Bourdieu is using these two to illuminate each other. We've already seen that de Certeau is concerned that in the attempt to move from the study of a specific culture to general social theory, he's worried that Bourdieu is obscuring the particular. The particular gets lost. It gets put to use in service of this theory, but is sort of violated in the process. But de Certeau is also hinting, he's doing a lot of hinting, that there are other problems here. So what might those be? The next section is called strategies. Designated as strategies, the practices studied by Bourdieu concern, for example, the system of succession in Baron. I assume that's sort of like property succession from parents to children, or the interior disposition of the Kabylian dwelling, or the distribution of tasks and periods in the course of the Kabylian year. Those are only a few genera of a species that includes strategies of fecundity, succession, education, hygiene, social or economic investment, marriage, etc. And also of reconversion when there is a gap between practices and situations. In each of the cases examined, differences permit us to specify some of the properties of a logic of practice. Okay, so differences. We have one section here. Number 2, A, B, C. Number 3, A, B, C. Number 4, A, B. So let's see what we can do with this. Number 1. Differences permit us to specify some of the properties of a logic of practice. Okay, so what are the properties of a logic of practice? This is de Certeau telling us what he thinks Pierre Bourdieu is saying. So 1. Genealogical tables or trees, surveys and geometrical plans of habitations, linear calendar cycles, these are totalizing and homogeneous productions, results of observational distance and neutralization with respect to the strategies themselves that constitute as islands, family relations practiced because they are useful, places that are distinguished by the inverted and successive movements of the body, or the periods of actions carried out one after another in rhythms that are peculiar to each and mutually incommensurable. Totalizing and homogeneous productions. So he's talking about almost like cosmologies, like mythological frameworks that encompass all of reality. In contrast, there can be a synoptic representation. So synoptic, what does it mean by that? As the instrument of summation and mastery through vision that levels and classes all the collected data. It is practice that organizes discontinuities. That's key for Bourdieu. Nodes of heterogeneous operations. Matters of family relationships, space and time are thus not the same in every case. Okay, and here's a little comment from de Certeau in this next paragraph. I would add that this difference is situated at the borderline between two ruses. And a ruse is a tactical move. With its synthetic tables, scientific method conceals the operations of withdrawal and power that makes them possible. For their part, by providing the data sought by the investigators, practitioners necessarily do not reveal the practical differences created among these data by the operations that make use of them, or do not make use of them. Thus they collaborate in the production of general tabulations, which conceal their tactics from the observer. Knowledge of practices is thus the result of a twofold deception. So recall that Bourdieu went to non-Western communities and studied their cultures. What de Certeau is saying is that the practitioners in those cultures, the actors or agents, conceal, in presenting their culture to an outside observer, they conceal the tactics that are available to them, the ways of working against the social structure. So the work of scientific discourse and summary that Bourdieu carries out, de Certeau thinks it's necessarily going to obscure certain aspects of what's happening on the ground. So that's number 1. Number 2, a strategy, for instance, that used in marrying a child off, and this is the type of cultural situation that Bourdieu analyzes, is the equivalent of, quote, taking a trick in a card game. It depends both on the deal, having a good hand, and on the way one plays the cards, being a good card player. Taking a trick involves both the postulates that determine a playing space and the rules that accord a value to the deal and certain options to the player. In short, an ability to maneuver within the different conditions in which the initial capital is committed. And capital is referring to Bourdieu's idea of social capital. The complex ensemble is a fabric of qualitatively distinct modes of functioning. Okay, so de Certeau is saying that navigating a social situation, like the relevant social strategies, is like playing cards. And it depends on the hand that you were dealt, and it also depends on your skill as a card player. But there are different ways of operating here. So now we come to sub point A. There are implicit principles or postulates, making sure my screen is good. For example, in a Bayesian marriage, the primacy of the man over the woman, or of the elder son over the younger, principles ensuring the integrity and protection of patrimony in an economy conditioned by the scarcity of money. But the fact that they are not defined, they are not made explicit, creates margins of tolerance and the possibility of setting one against the other. So these implicit principles are part of the card game of social strategy, but because they're not explicitly defined, there's some flexibility. You can work against them a little bit. B, there are explicit rules. For example, the adot, the recompense allotted to younger sons in exchange for their renunciation of their rights to the land. But they are accompanied by a limit that inverts them. For example, the torn adot, the restitution of the adot in case of a marriage without issue. So the younger son has get a sort of payout because they're not going to receive the bulk of the family inheritance. But if the older son doesn't have any children, that payout has to be returned. Presumably because the children of the younger son will get that inheritance down the road. Every utilization of these rules must thus take into account the possibility of this threatening, because linked to the contingencies of life rebound against it. So even the explicit rules, when you use them, might get undone because of some contingency. C. Strategies, subtle combinations. Action is tortuous. Navigate among the rules. Play with all the possibilities offered by traditions. Make use of one tradition rather than another. Compensate for one by means of another. Taking advantage of the flexible surface, which covers up the hard core, they create their own relevance within this network. More than that, like students manipulating their grade point average, balancing a high grade in an easy course against a low grade in a difficult course, they move and slide from one function to another, short-circuiting economic, social, and symbolic divisions. For example, a small number of children, a matter of fertility, compensates for a bad marriage, a matrimonial failure. Or keeping a younger son unmarried in the home as a servant without salary, an economic investment and a restriction on fertility, allows one to avoid having to pay him the adot, a matrimonial advantage. Strategies do not, quote, apply principles or rules. They choose among them to make up the repertory of their operations. So if you remember the idea of habitus in the background here, these dispositions that orient us to social practices, de Certeau is commenting on how social actors can interact strategically with the social rules available to them. So this is more conscious than what Bourdieu means by the idea of habitus. And I'm actually a little unclear whether de Certeau is offering his own ideas now or still commenting on Bourdieu. Number 3. Comparable to transfers and metaphorizations, constant passages from one genre to another, these practices presuppose a logic. And the practices he's referring to are the way that we sort of play cards, or the way that an individual plays cards, quote unquote, or utilizes the social rules as if they were playing cards. Even more clever than usual in this case, Bourdieu, outwitting the practices themselves in order to fix them in the labyrinthine developments of his language, discerns in them several essential procedures. So what are the possibilities available to someone who is strategically navigating social rules? A. polythetism. The same thing has uses and properties that vary according to the arrangements into which it enters. So the same thing can be used in multiple ways. B, substitutability. A thing is always replaceable by another because of the affinity of each with the others within the totality that the thing represents. So one thing can be replaced by another thing in the social structure. Euphemism. One must hide the fact that actions conflict with the dichotomies and antinomies represented by the symbolic system. So if you're violating the rules of the social structure, you have to hide it. Ritual actions furnish the model for euphemism by combining contraries. And ritual is one way this happens, this euphemism happens. Okay. Finally, analogy is the foundation of all these procedures, which are transgressions of the symbolic order and the limits it sets. They are camouflaged transgressions, inserted metaphors, and precisely in that measure they become acceptable, taken as legitimate, since they respect the distinctions established by language, even as they undermine them. From this point of view, to acknowledge the authority of rules is exactly the opposite of applying them. That's an interesting point. This fundamental chiasm may be returning today, since we have to apply laws whose authority we no longer recognize. In any event, it is not without interest that Bourdieu rediscovers, at the ultimate source of these practices, the very use of analogy, which the scientists whose works he collected in 1968 held to be the essence of theoretical creation. I just want to comment that analogy, if there's a single way of thinking about the way that de Certeau's book is structured, this book, The Practice of Everyday Life, it's analogy. He uses a string of analogies to illuminate each other. So I think de Certeau, again, he seeks to perform his argument. He's interested in operating in the way that strategic, tactical actors do when they are navigating social rules. He wants to do that with his book. But right now he's commenting on what Bourdieu observes, which is that analogy is also the tool of social strategy. He's still not giving us a sort of nice takeaway, but let's keep going, hopefully, through this the rest of this section. Okay, number 4. In sum, these practices are all dominated by what I shall call an economy of the proper place. Recall that proper place is a key idea, a key element of how de Certeau defines strategy. It's a way of acting that has its own place that it controls. In Bourdieu's analysis, this economy takes 2 forms, equally fundamental but unarticulated. On the one hand, the maximization of the capital, material and symbolic wealth, that constitutes the essence of patrimony. On the other, the development of the body, both individual and collective, that generates duration through its fertility and space through its movements. The proliferation of tricks, of their successes or failures, is related to the economy which works to reproduce and make fruitful these 2 distinct and yet complementary forms of the dwelling, wealth and the body, land and heirs. A politics of this place is everywhere at the base of these strategies. Okay. So it's nice he tells us in sum. He's giving us a general account of what he's said so far. And he's been analyzing social practices, or he's been describing how Bourdieu analyzes social practices. And what de Certeau tells us is all the strategies that Bourdieu identifies depend on a proper place. There is a politics of the place everywhere. And we can already guess that because de Certeau is interested not in strategies that depend on place, but in tactics that depend on not having a place, that de Certeau thinks that it's very likely that Bourdieu has missed some really important aspects of how these societies or cultures that he studies work. So let's keep going. Hence, we have the two characteristics that make these strategies practices entirely peculiar to the closed space in which Bourdieu examines them, and to the way in which he observes them. A. He always presupposes a twofold link between these practices and a proper place, a patrimony, on the one hand, and a collective principle of administration, the family, the group, on the other. What happens when this double postulate does not hold? This is an interesting question, because such is the case of our technocratic societies. So, talking about us now, with respect to which the proprietary and familial insularities of earlier ages and other cultures have become utopian lost worlds, if not Robinson Crusoe-like adventures. So, the way that Bourdieu organizes or thinks about social strategy depends on this proper place, which depends on things like patrimony and very dense family structures that just don't exist in modern technocratic societies. So de Certeau's like, hey, you're trying to develop a social theory out of this ethnography that you did. How can this conceivably apply to modern societies? When Bourdieu encounters the same type of practices among today's petit bourgeois or housewives, they are merely short-term and short-sighted strategies, anarchical responses relative to a disparate ensemble of semi-knowledges, to a cultural sabir, a mere bric-a-brac of decontextualized concepts. A single practical logic is nevertheless at work, but independently of the place that controls its functioning in traditional societies. That is to say, in the outline, the problematic of the place seems to win out over the problematic of practices. So there is no fixed place for these modern social strategies. So how do we think about them then? So de Certeau is he's doing an internal critique of Bourdieu. He's saying, you haven't given us enough to make sense of contemporary practices. The use of the term strategy is no less limited. It is justified by the fact that practices give an adequate response to contingent situations. But at the same time, Bourdieu repeats that it is not a matter of strategy strictly speaking. There is no choice among several possibilities, and thus no strategic intention. Remember that habitus does not involve necessarily an intention toward a goal. There's no introduction of correctives due to better information, and thus not the slightest calculation. There is no prediction, but only an assumed world, as the repetition of the past. In short, it is because subjects do not know, strictly speaking, what they are doing, that what they do has more meaning than they realize. Docta ignorantia, therefore, learned ignorance, a cleverness that does not recognize itself as such. This is the idea of habitus, that subjects, actors, individuals living in society don't fully know what they're doing because they have inherited these dispositions from the past, which perpetuate themselves. But those dispositions mean that there's more meaning to each person's actions than they realize. But de Certeau is saying, if that's the case, why use the word strategy? Why speak as if navigating social situations is like playing cards when most of what's going on is unconscious? So again, he's doing an internal critique of Bourdieu and saying the account here is not fully coherent. With these strategies, governed by their place, knowledgeable but unknown, the most traditionalist sort of ethnology returns. In the insular reserves in which it observed them, it considered the elements of a people and its culture as coherent and unconscious. This is Bourdieu's position. Two indissociable aspects. In order for coherence to be the postulate of ethnological knowledge, to be, that is, the place it allocated for itself, and the epistemological model to which it referred, it was necessary to put this knowledge at a distance from the objectified society, and thus to presuppose that it was foreign and superior to the knowledge the society had of itself. So to see these coherent but unconscious dispositions, habitus, you have to look in from the outside at a particular society. The unconsciousness of the group studied was the price that had to be paid, the price it had to pay for its coherence. The reason is the coherence depends on these unconscious dispositions or habitus. And of course, you can see why you have to go to another society to do this work, because to do it on your own society presupposes that you could become conscious of those dispositions, which would sort of unravel the whole game. A society could be a system only without knowing it. Whence the corollary, an ethnologist was required to know what the society was without knowing it. Today, okay, so this is interesting. So he's actually saying even the person studying the other culture has to know what this society is without knowing it. I'm not sure why that would be the case, because it would seem like if you're coming in from the outside, you could know in a more conscious way. But you can see how this gets us to the idea of learned ignorance, which was the title of this section on Bourdieu. It's this paradoxical state of making something known that is in a sense unknowable because it's fundamentally unconscious. So de Certeau continues, today, an ethnologist would no longer dare to say, if not to think that. How can Bourdieu compromise himself in this way in the name of sociology? I think this is the big point that de Certeau has been leading up to in this discussion of Bourdieu, which is to say that there's a fundamental tension or contradiction in the whole method, because he's trying to make something conscious which is fundamentally unconscious, and that the whole coherence of the social structure depends on habitus remaining unconscious. So how can Bourdieu make it conscious? I am at an hour here, but I would like to get through this section so that we can really round out what's going on here with de Certeau's discussion of Bourdieu. So let's see, theory goes through. It's about another 5 pages, but let's see what I can do. So, theory. Insofar as sociology defines objective structures on the basis of regularities provided by statistics, themselves based on empirical investigations, de Certeau does not like objective structures or regularities provided by statistics. It's not that he dislikes them, he just thinks they miss a whole lot. But insofar as sociology does this, insofar as it considers every situation or objective conjuncture as a particular state of one of these structures, it must account for the adjustment or non-adjustment of practices with respect to the structures. Practices. This is the whole premise of de Certeau's book. How do people relate to broad, objective, fixed structures through practice in ways that are subversive? Where is the harmony that one generally observes between practices and structures, the latter being present as particular cases constituted by conjunctures, come from? So how is it that practice follows these structures that sociology tries to measure and define through statistics? Answers to this question resort either to a reflex automatism in practices, people just don't have a choice, or to the subjective genius of their creators. I guess that means Yeah, this is the dichotomy that we saw way back looking at the text of Bourdieu. Either that people are totally determined by the social structure, or that people have this individual ability for creative action. With good reason, Bourdieu rejects both of these hypotheses. He replaces them with his theory, which seeks to explain the adequation of practices to structures through their genesis. In other words, people act in ways that fit with social structures. Why? Bourdieu says we can find out if we look at the way that social structures are reproduced, which is not top-down, but which is through the very actions themselves and the dispositions that generate the actions, habitus. One could point out that the terms of the problem have been somewhat rigged. Of the three groups of data under consideration, structures, situations, and practices, only the second two, which correspond to each other, are observed. So we have structures, situations, practices. In contrast, the structures are inferred from statistics and thus are constructed models. Before allowing oneself to be locked into this theoretical problem, however, two preliminary epistemological questions need to be raised. A, concerning the presumed objectivity of these structures, an objectivity based on the conviction that the real itself speaks through the discourse of the sociologist. So first, we need to ask about how objective these structures really are. And B, concerning the limits of observed practices or situations, and especially of statistical representations of them, in relation to the totalities structural models claim to account for. So, kind of the same question. How objective are these structures? And what are the limits of the data that is used to the practices and situations on which these theoretical structures are based? But unfortunately, these preliminary questions are forgotten in the name of a supposed theoretical urgency. In the terms in which he encounters the problem of adequation, Bourdieu has to find something that can adjust practices to structures, and yet also explain the gaps remaining between them. He needs a supplementary category. He locates it in a process which is his forte as a specialist in the sociology of education, the acquisition of knowledge. Okay. So just recall, de Certeau is inching us toward a new question, a new problem in the thought of Bourdieu, by asking how it is that we account in general for the way that individual actions conform to social structures. And he's inching us now toward the explanation that Bourdieu gives, which we've already seen as habitus. And you can guess that he's going to find another tension or contradiction here in the way that Bourdieu gives his account. So this acquisition of knowledge, this is the sought for mediation between the structures that organize it and the dispositions, the human tendencies it produces. This genesis implies an interiorization of structures through learning and an exteriorization of achievements, what Bourdieu calls the habitus in practices. It's a little different than I was thinking of habitus as an exteriorization of achievements. I was thinking of habitus as the unconscious dispositions. So a temporal dimension is thus introduced. Practices expressing the experience correspond adequately to situations manifesting the structures, if and only if the structure remains stable for the duration of the process of interiorization/exteriorization. If not, practices lag behind, thus resembling the structure at the preceding point, the point at which it was interiorized by the habitus. It's a tough sentence. I think the gist is a habitus is the internal disposition that enables actions and social structures to correspond to each other, to match over time. According to this analysis, structures can change and thus become a principle of social mobility, and even the only one. Achievements cannot. They have no movement of their own. They are the place in which structures are inscribed, the marble in which their history is engraved. Nothing happens in them that is not the result of their exteriority. As in the traditional image of primitive or peasant societies, nothing moves, there's no history, other than that written on them by an alien order. Structures can change. Achievements cannot. I'm not sure where he's going with this. The immobility of this memory guarantees, for the theory, that the socio-economic system will be faithfully reproduced in practices. And this is recognizable from Bourdieu. This is his question: how does the socio-economic system get reproduced? It's through habitus. It's through these dispositions that shape how persons act. Thus, it is not education or training, visible phenomena, that plays the central role here, but rather their expected result, achievements, the habitus. Okay, I see why he's talking about achievements and why he views habitus as it's exterior in the sense that it's produced by the social structure. The habitus provides the basis for explaining a society in relationship to structures. But there is a price to be paid for this explanation. Okay, so now he's going to give us his take. In order to be able to assume that the basis has such a stability, it must be unverifiable and visible. Okay, so Bourdieu's big intervention, which lets us explain how the actions of individuals cohere with or are consistent with social structures, these regularities that sociology observes. The big thing that Bourdieu tells us, habitus, de Certeau says, cool, that's a great idea, but the price we pay for using that idea is that we have to rely to explain all this observable data, this thing that is totally unverifiable and unobservable. So now he's going to give us a little comparison with Foucault, which is nice to see, like, where does he think the differences lie. So what interests Bourdieu is the genesis, the mode of generation of practices. Not, as in Foucault, what they produce, but what produces them. So Foucault is looking at social practices, prisons, hospitals, schools, and asking what they produce. What kind of social system do they produce? Bourdieu is taking a step back and saying, that's interesting, that's good, but where did those social practices come from in the first place? And Bourdieu's answer is, they come from these dispositions, these internally available modes of acting. From the ethnological case studies that are to examine them to the sociology that is to develop a theory of them, there is thus a displacement which moves the discourse in the direction of the habitus, whose synonyms, exis, ethos, modus operandi, common sense, second nature, helpful to think of habitus as just a socially constructed common sense. So the synonyms, definitions, and justifications become more and more numerous. In the transition from ethnology to sociology, the hero changes. A passive and nocturnal actor is substituted for the sly multiplicity of strategies. Because habitus is unconscious, because it sort of determines social action, it doesn't account for this sly multiplicity of strategies. This immobile stone figure is supposed to be the agent that produces the phenomena observed in a society. He is an essential character, in fact, because he makes the circular movement of the theory possible. Henceforth, from structures, it passes to the habitus, a word Bourdieu always puts in italics. From the latter to strategies, which are adjusted to conjunctures, themselves reduced to the structures of which they are the results in particular states. So it's a circle. Structures cause habitus. Habitus comes back around to recreate the structures. In fact, this circle moves from a constructed model, the structure, to an assumed reality, the habitus. You can tell, I think this is where he's going to complain. But it's not an observed reality, but it's an assumed reality. And from the latter to an interpretation of observed facts. So we construct a social model based on data. We assume an explanation, the habitus. And then finally, from there, we go to an observation, to an interpretation of observed facts. But what is even more striking than the heterogeneous character of the pieces the theory puts in a circle is the role it assigns to the ethnological fragments, which are to close the gap in the sociological coherence. Fragments, things that maybe don't fit. The other, Kabbilian or Bernian, furnishes the element that the theory needs in order to work and to explain everything. This remote foreign element has all the characteristics that define the habitus. Coherence, stability, unconsciousness, territoriality, achievements are the equivalent of patrimony. It is represented by the habitus in an invisible place, where, as in the Kabbilian dwelling, the structures are inverted as they are interiorized, and where the writing flips over again in exteriorizing itself in the form of practices that have the deceptive appearance of being free improvisations. Practices appear to be free improvisations because even though they seem to be strategic, they're based on this unconscious disposition or habitus. It is indeed the dwelling as a silent and determining memory which is hidden in the theory under the metaphor of the habitus. So he's using Bourdieu against himself in some way because dwelling is this main idea from his ethnographic study, and which, moreover, gives the supposition a certain referentiality, an appearance of reality. As a consequence of its theoretical metaphorization, this referentiality amounts, however, to no more than a plausibility. The dwelling gives the habitus its form, but not a content. In any case, Bourdieu's argument is concerned less to indicate that reality than to show its necessity and the advantages of his hypothesis for the theory. Thus, the habitus becomes a dogmatic place, if one takes dogma to mean the affirmation of a reality which the discourse needs in order to be totalizing. Oh, that's an interesting definition of dogma. If you remember from last week, the discussion of Foucault, his problem with Foucault as well is that Foucault takes his own analysis of power in society to be kind of a complete analysis. And so it becomes its own way of exercising power. So Foucault describes strategies of surveillance as a means of control, but then sets up his own theoretical panopticon that can see everything. He's kind of making the same criticism of Bourdieu. He's setting up a theoretical structure that explains everything. But in order to do that explaining, it requires this idea of habitus to become sort of a fixed dogma, even though it's unobservable and it's a mere theoretical construct. I'll continue. No doubt it still has, like many dogmas, the heuristic value of displacing and renewing possibilities of research. So it's valuable, but it still takes on this kind of dogmatic flavor. Bourdieu's texts are fascinating in their analyses and aggressive in their theory. In reading them, I feel myself captive to a passion that they simultaneously exacerbate and excite. They are full of contrasts, scrupulously examining practices and their logic, in a way that surely has had no equivalent since Mos. The texts finally reduce them to a mystical reality, the habitus, which is to bring them under the law of reproduction. Marcel Mauss, Anthropology of the Gift. De Certeau loves the careful, scrupulous analysis of empirical reality. He does not like the way Bourdieu tries to find a totalizing theory that explains his observations. The subtle descriptions of Bjarnian or Kabelian tactics suddenly give way to violently imposed truths, as if the complexity so lucidly examined required the brutal counterpoint of a dogmatic reason. There are contrasts also in the style, twisted and labyrinthine in its pursuits, and massively repetitive in its affirmations. I think I can get on board with that. A strange combination of an I know that crafty and transgressive proliferation, and in all the same, there must be a totalizing meaning. In order to escape from this aggressive seduction, I assume in turn that in this contrast, something essential for the analysis of tactics must be at stake. So he's finally bringing us to his own idea of tactics. The blanket Bourdieu's theory throws over tactics, as if to put out their fire by certifying their amenability to socioeconomic rationality, or as if to mourn their death by declaring them unconscious, should teach us something about their relationship with any theory. I think this is maybe the most important sentence so far. De Certeau thinks that Bourdieu does theoretical violence to empirical reality. Specifically, it eliminates the possibility of tactics, and it eliminates the possibility of something that cannot be reduced to socioeconomic rationality. De Certeau wants to say, no matter how powerful the theories of Foucault or Bourdieu might be, there's something irreducible about human action that cannot be captured by these social theories, that cannot be totalized in a theory. Again, I think this is just the fundamental claim and starting point of de Certeau's book. He argues for that claim in a way. It's also just, in a way, just an assumption. He's just saying, I'm going to assume this is the case. I'm going to write in a way that exemplifies what I assume to be the case. I'm going to show you that it's possible. And I'm also going to show you what it looks like to do it by, on the one hand, taking these famous social theorists very seriously, and on the other hand, by showing the internal tensions and contradictions in their work, and in some ways even poking fun at them. I think that's what de Certeau is doing here. These tactics, through their criteria and procedures, are supposed to make use of the institutional and symbolic organization in such an autonomous way that if it were to take them seriously, the scientific representation of society would become lost in them, in every sense of the word. In other words, if sociology or social theory tried to take tactics seriously, it couldn't really do what it does. Its postulates and ambitions could not resist them. Norms, generalizations, and segmentations would yield to the transverse and metaphorizing pullulation of these differentiating activities. Mathematics and the exact sciences constantly refine their logics in order to follow the aleatory and microscopic movements of non-human phenomena. The social sciences, whose object is still more subtle and whose tools are much cruder, would have to defend their models, that is, their ambition to dominate and control. This just tells you de Certeau really doesn't like theories, grand theories, because he thinks they're used to dominate and control. By exorcising such a proliferation, the social sciences have to get rid of tactics and have to ignore tactics because they can't be theorized. They can't be theorized in a totalizing theory. They can be theorized in a tactical way, which is what de Certeau is trying to do in this book. And in fact, in accord with the proven methods of exorcism, they consider such a proliferation to be singular, local, unconscious, alien in principle, and without realizing it, revelatory of the knowledge that their scientific judge has of these practices. When the observer is sufficiently enclosed within his judicial institution, and thus sufficiently blind, everything goes fine. The discourse he produces has every appearance of holding together. In Bourdieu's book, there is nothing of the kind. To be sure, at a first, only too obvious level, he gives the impression of departing, of going toward these tactics, but only in order to return, to confirm the professional rationality. This is only a false departure, a textual strategy. But isn't this hasty return an indication that he knows the danger, the perhaps mortal danger, to which these all too intelligent practices expose scientific knowledge? Certeau is suggesting that Bourdieu realizes that if he took tactics into account, the real particularity of human action into account, the whole edifice of theory would collapse. He reflects a distantly Pascalian combination of the erosion of reason and dogmatic faith. He knows a great deal about scientific knowledge and the power by which it is established, as well as about these tactics, whose wiles he outwits with such virtuosity in his texts. He thus proceeds to imprison these devices behind the bars of the unconscious and to deny, through the fetish of the habitus. Okay, so now he's saying that Bourdieu's theoretical construct is a fetish. In the Freudian sense, it's like it's a kind of obsession, a thing that you use to deal with unconscious needs. What reason would have to have if it is to be more than la raison de plus forte? If she's more than, I don't know exactly what he means by that. He affirms with the concept of habitus the contrary of what he knows. This is the learned ignorance, a traditional popular tactic. In this protection, a tribute paid to the authority of reason gives him the scientific possibility of observing these tactics in carefully circumscribed places. So, Certeau is being very tricky with language right now. He's saying Bourdieu knows that tactics are, that like there are these irreducible modes of acting in the societies that he studies. He invents this theoretical construct, habitus, and uses the theoretical construct to affirm the opposite of what he knows to be the case. Because Certeau, I think, is assuming that Bourdieu must know that the social reality is too complex to capture in a theory. But he goes ahead anyway, with this fetish, the habitus, to affirm the thing that he wants, which is to have an overarching theory, a totalizing theory. But this mode of affirming what you know not to be the case is a tactic. It's a popular, traditional tactic, this learned ignorance. So Bourdieu, in denying tactics, is being tactical. Why? It's a protection, a tribute paid to the authority of reason, which gives him the scientific possibility of observing these tactics in carefully circumscribed places, placing the tactics in boxes and categories, which don't ultimately describe them accurately. So de Certeau is saying that in denying tactics, Bourdieu is being tactical. He is unconsciously reproducing a social structure that denies the possibility of tactics in the name of totalizing reason, theory. It's very sneaky. It's very, I mean, of everything I've read so far, like this paragraph wonderfully captures how de Certeau wants to show us what tactics look like. He's being slippery, and he's turning Bourdieu over and against himself, using Bourdieu against himself, which is exactly what he does with Foucault as well, but this feels even more subtle. If that were true, but who could say? Bourdieu would teach us as much about it through his dogmatism as through his case studies. The discourse that hides what he knows, instead of hiding what he doesn't know, would have theoretical value precisely insofar as it practices what it knows. So Bourdieu shows us what is the case in spite of himself. It would be the result of a conscious relationship with an outside it cannot eliminate, not merely the scene of an elucidation. Would it thus come down to the docta ignorantia claimed to be knowledgeable without knowing it precisely because it knows only too well what it does not and cannot say? This phrase, docta ignorantia, isn't, it has a context, which is theological, I believe. It has to do with the knowledge of God, where any knowledge of God is learned ignorance, because the reality it seeks to know always so far surpasses the ability of the knower. So it's learned, like a theologian might be learned, might know a lot, but it's learned ignorance because all that knowledge is, yeah, thanks, Vivi. I agree. He is incredibly brilliant. The more I read, the more I agree with that. I'd love to look at Lefebvre as well. So thanks for that comment. Anyway, this learned ignorance idea has a context. And de Certeau is playfully applying it to Bourdieu. So this is a good place to stop. This was a very long live stream, but hopefully it provided some sense of what's going on here in de Certeau's discussion of Bourdieu, and also a way into the text. This is a difficult text. It's an intricate text. It's dense. It presupposes a lot of knowledge that it takes some work to gather in advance. So I hope this is helpful. I'm really interested in this way, just to make one point of application. Certeau is so resistant to this scientific representation of society, or to the reduction of human behavior to a set of predictable generalizations. This is his complaint about Foucault and Bourdieu. That desire to bring human behavior to heel, to find its predictable structures, has certainly intensified, and it's moved from the academy, which is where de Certeau is observing it, to the world of large corporations who seek to control our behavior through algorithms. Something very hopeful about de Certeau's insistence that human behavior, the rules, the laws, the modes of human behavior are irreducible to generalizations or algorithms. That there's a fundamental freedom to resist and to act independently. That gives me hope. I don't know whether we can prove that it's true, but I think de Certeau gives us a really nice case for that hope, and a demonstration of what it might look like. So thanks. If you want to connect further, I'll be here again next week, and also feel free to head over to my